The first thing I remember is the taste of copper in my mouth, thick and metallic, clinging to my tongue like a warning I couldn't yet understand. My vision was blurred, half lit by the flickering lights of the chamber I had been thrown into, a cold place smelling of oil, rust, and antiseptic. I didn't know where I was, only that something had changed. Something inside me had already begun to shift, though I didn't yet know the shape it would take. Voices echoed around me, deep and hollow, like chanting from a cathedral lost to time. The words were unintelligible, yet they resonated with a strange, instinctive dread. I felt my body tense without knowing why, my muscles coiling, my heart pumping faster as if it knew the purpose for which I had been chosen. I had been a simple man once, Crix Voss, a mechanic in the underhive, repairing water recyclers and machinery no one else could touch. The world above had little use for people like me, and I had been content with that. But contentment is a luxury the Imperium does not allow. I had been ripped from that life, cast into the hands of men whose devotion to the Emperor eclipsed any notion of mercy or morality. Chains bit into my wrists, cold steel against warmer skin. But the pain was only the beginning. My mind screamed for comprehension, but comprehension was denied. My purpose was being rewritten, my very identity dissected and reassembled by invisible hands. The first whispers of rage and fear, the first flickers of the machine I would become, began here in this chamber, and yet even now, buried beneath the fear, beneath the transformation, a small, stubborn spark of who I had been clung to life. It whispered of grease-stained hands, quiet camaraderie, and evenings spent beneath the hum of machinery. That spark would not survive unscathed, but it would endure long enough to remember. In this place, I would begin to learn what it meant to be chosen, to be remade, to become a weapon not for glory, not for survival, but for the will of a God whose name I was compelled to obey. My story begins here, in the darkness, with the taste of copper and the faint echo of a life that would soon be erased. The chains rattled as they dragged me across the cold, unfeeling floor. I tried to resist at first, but resistance was futile. They had stripped me of everything, identity, freedom, and even the hope that I might one day return to the life I had known. My captors spoke little, only the occasional barked command, their faces obscured by respirators and lenses that reflected no light, no warmth. They treated me as if I were already nothing more than raw material to be shaped into something far darker than myself. The first injections came without ceremony. I could feel the chemicals burning through my veins, burning away the hesitation, the doubt, the part of me that questioned obedience. I screamed, but no one responded. My voice was lost in a chorus of distant clanging and chanting, replaced by the rising rhythm of my own accelerating heartbeat. My mind began to fracture, tiny fissures spreading across memories of the man I had been. I tried to cling to the image of my workshop, to the satisfaction of fixing broken machinery, but even that began to blur, melting into the haze of chemical-induced obedience. They removed my clothes, then my identity. Tattoos, scars, even the smallest marks that had once made me human were catalogued, photographed, and then erased from consideration. They cut, they grafted, they implanted. Small devices first, tiny electrodes seeding themselves into my nervous system, teaching my body to obey commands that had not yet been spoken. Pain was constant, unyielding, a teacher I could not refuse. And yet it was not fear that drove me. It was something deeper, a programmed obsession with failure itself. Failing the Emperor's will was a sin greater than death, and that sin became my new obsession. My thoughts began to narrow, funneled down to a single purpose. Each flicker of resistance, each memory of Crix Voss the mechanic, was treated as a virus, hunted by the chemical and neural agents flooding my body. My skin prickled, my muscles twitching involuntarily, adapting before I even realized I had moved. The room became a crucible, and I was the raw ore within it. Every nerve, every sinew, every flicker of memory was analyzed, catalogued, and reconstructed. They showed me nothing of what I was becoming, yet every modification was a revelation. My bones groaned under the strain of reinforcement. Muscle tissue was augmented, reshaped, optimized for efficiency and destruction. My senses were heightened, my pain threshold obliterated, until even the sharpest lacerations were mere inconveniences. Each chemical infusion, each graft, each neural implant rewrote the man I had been into a weapon dedicated entirely to the Emperor. And as they worked, I caught glimpses of my reflection in polished metal. The eyes staring back were not mine, yet they were. Fear had been replaced by focus, hesitation replaced by instinct. Somewhere, deep and stubborn, Crix Voss still existed, buried beneath layers of augmentation and obedience. But with each passing moment, each searing injection, each grinding surgical modification, that spark of humanity dimmed further, replaced by something unfeeling, something lethal, something inevitable. I was no longer a man. I was becoming a weapon, a perfect instrument of death. And yet, even as they tore away my past, a tiny, almost imperceptible fragment of me remembered. It remembered the smell of oil, the hum of machinery, the quiet satisfaction of work done well. It remembered that I had once lived, and that memory, fragile as it was, would not die without a fight. The real transformation began once they deemed my body ready to accept the machinery of war. The surgical tables were cold, the tools colder, yet the heat of anticipation, or was it dread, burned hotter in my veins. They told me nothing of what would be done next, only that obedience was survival, and failure would be obliteration. First came the skeletal reinforcement. My bones groaned as metal supports were grafted into my frame, merging with organic matter in a way that blurred the line between flesh and alloy. Each procedure brought me closer to being a machine, yet the machines around me seemed gentle compared to the human cost of my new body. My muscles were reshaped, enhanced through a combination of chemical growth stimulants and surgical grafting. Strength that had once been human became something monstrous, something designed to crush bone and tear through armor. Then came the neural implants, tiny nodes buried along my spinal column and embedded deep within my brain allowed for instantaneous reaction times, linking me to the pulse of command structures I could barely comprehend. I could feel thought itself being rearranged, memories shuffled, desires erased, priorities rewritten. The man who once worried over unpaid bills, over friendships and fleeting pleasures, was being overwritten with obsession and precision. There was no space left for doubt, for hesitation. Every synapse bent toward one goal: execute the Emperor's will. My senses were next. Eyes sharpened to detect the faintest movement, ears tuned to frequencies humans could never hear. Olfactory sensors enhanced to detect the faintest chemical traces of fear. I could sense vibrations in the floor, the heartbeat of distant prey, the rustle of fabric as someone moved unconsciously. It was terrifying and exhilarating, like becoming predator and prey simultaneously. Then came the weapons. They were not tools. They were extensions of myself, each implanted and integrated to function seamlessly with my augmented frame. My left arm was replaced with a power weapon system capable of cutting through steel as if it were paper. Neural interfaces wove into my left hemisphere, training it for one thing only: lethality. My right arm retained more of its humanity, but was reinforced with subcutaneous armor and muscle enhancers. With it, I could crush bone and tear through flesh as though they were nothing more than scrap metal. The most insidious augmentation came last. The neural spike projectors implanted in my skull. They were both receivers and transmitters, capable of broadcasting fear, agony, and terror directly into the minds of enemies, while also accepting signals from my handlers to override my will if necessary. It was a violation of the mind, intimate and profound, making me a weapon in body and in consciousness. I caught myself staring at my reflection once again, in a small polished surface on the wall. The eyes were still mine, but the face staring back was no longer human. It was predatory, angular, and enhanced, a mask of inevitability. Yet behind that mask, behind the reinforced bones and weaponized flesh, a flicker of Krix Voss remained. A whisper of the man who had once loved the quiet, the mechanical, the human. I hated it for surviving, but it also terrified me, because it meant I remembered what I had lost. They were finished for now, but I knew better than to believe the process was complete. The next stage would not be about augmentations to flesh and steel. It would be about augmentations to mind, obedience, and purpose. And I feared that more than anything, because even in my growing monstrosity, a small human part of me wanted to survive, not as a weapon, but as a man. The steel doors to the training hall shut with a hiss that reminded me of a predator's breath before it strikes. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, blood, and scorched metal. It was no longer a place for men, it was a crucible for weapons. They began with the mind before the body. Rows of restraint chairs lined a dimly lit chamber, each fitted with neural spikes and injection ports. We were strapped in like convicts awaiting execution. The first jolt of conditioning tore through my nervous system like molten iron, rewriting my thoughts, my memories, my instincts. Obedience was drilled not with words but with pain and chemical punishment. Hesitation earned agony. Compliance earned release. Voices echoed in my skull, not just one, but many. Command directives, psychological triggers, battle chants of the ecclesiarchy, all wired into my brain until I could not tell if they were my thoughts or theirs. They stripped away the concept of I and replaced it with we. We were the Emperor's blades, the Emperor's wrath, the Emperor's will. Then came the drills. Endless hours of simulated combat scenarios, each more brutal than the last. We learned to kill without hesitation, without question, without mercy. Close combat, range strikes, demolitions, infiltration. Every possible form of slaughter practiced until it became instinct. Until muscle memory replaced thought. We were taught to fight not as individuals, but as a single organism. Neural link systems in our collars allowed the thoughts of one to bleed into the others. We could feel each other's positions, hear each other's heartbeats, know when to move, when to strike, when to kill. It was terrifying and exhilarating, like being a cell in a living beast of war. Pain was constant, but so was the reinforcement. Combat stimulants flooded our veins to heighten aggression. Pain inhibitors dulled wounds that would have incapacitated any normal soldier, and reward surges lit up our pleasure centers whenever we executed commands flawlessly. We were being rewired, not only to obey, but to crave obedience. When training turned lethal, and it always did, the weaker recruits simply stopped moving. Their collars pulsed, their bodies went still, and they were dragged away to be recycled or discarded. No names were spoken, no funerals given. We were no longer people. We were inventory. Between drills, our living quarters resembled weapon lockers more than cells. Small cold compartments lined with reinforced plating. No beds, no comforts, just hooks and restraints to keep us stored until needed. Food came in tasteless nutrient paste. Sleep was a fleeting, chemically induced state. We existed in a twilight between waking and readiness, always half a heartbeat from activation. And yet, amid the horror, fragments of my old self flickered. A gesture from another recruit, a tilt of the head, a hesitant glance, would spark a flash of recognition. We had once been human, criminals, dissidents, nobodies. Now we were becoming something else entirely, bound not by choice but by design. The instructors watched us like hawks. Ecclesiarchy priests with augmented vocal cords would bellow sermons of righteous fury while activating our collars, turning our bodies into instruments of their will. We learned quickly, hesitate and you suffer, defy and you die. By the time the conditioning cycle neared completion, I no longer thought of myself as Crix Voss. I no longer thought of myself at all. I had become Unit 77 Gamma, a designation whispered in binary by the handlers. My hands twitched when idle, longing for a weapon. My heart rate spiked at the scent of simulated blood. And somewhere deep inside, the last remnants of my humanity screamed silently against the rising tide of obedience. This was no longer training. This was erasure. This was rebirth. First deployment. Section begins immediately in the mission. No flashback or transport scenes. They woke me with violence. No briefing. No words. Just the hiss of depressurized clamps and the sudden drop in temperature as the pod split open around me like a metal rib cage. One heartbeat I was frozen in chemical stillness. The next I was sprinting through smoke, lungs burning with combat stims, mind stripped to its killing core. The ground shook beneath my boots, not with fear, but with artillery. The sky was black, burned by the exhaust of dropships and the glow of orbital bombardment. My HUD flickered runes of target designations I didn't remember learning to read. My heart was a furnace. My veins screamed with hypertoxins. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. The first enemy I saw was a blur of motion and heat. I hit him before he finished turning, my clawed gauntlet punching through armor like wet parchment. His scream was short, crushed breath in a collapsing chest. I didn't watch him fall. My brain was already calculating new angles of slaughter, mapping pressure points, measuring distance to the next pulse of life. Shots cracked across the battlefield. Too slow, too predictable. I was already there, moving faster than their fear could register. A squad tried to scatter. I tore through them with such force that my armor whined in protest. Their weapons clattered uselessly to the ground beside torn limbs and shattered ribs. There were no orders, only directives burned into my spine long ago. Eliminate. Advance. Do not stop. Do not think. The air reeked of propellant, blood, and ozone. Something in me, some ghost of instinct, recognized the smell of burning flesh. It should have meant something. It didn't. The chemicals in my system smothered meaning before it could form. A heavy gun emplacement roared to life at my flank. I didn't take cover. I sprinted through the storm of shells, the impacts hammering my frame but failing to slow me. I vaulted the barricade and crushed the gunner's head against the plating with one hand. His comrade tried to scream for mercy. The word didn't exist in my programming. By the time the local command realized I was on the field, half their defenses were gone. Vox traffic spiked with panic, fragments of voices begging for reinforcements that would never arrive. I moved through corridors slick with blood, my footsteps echoing like drumbeats of execution. One of them tried to hide. I remember the way he trembled when I dragged him out from behind the shattered bulkhead. His eyes were wide, his voice caught halfway between prayer and pleading. I could have ended him quickly. Instead, I watched him struggle as my blade pierced through his gut. Slow, deliberate. I didn't know why. Maybe the toxins wanted it that way. Maybe I did. The screams didn't linger in my mind. Nothing did. When extraction arrived, they didn't speak to me. They didn't thank me. They didn't even look at the bodies. They just sealed me back into the pod, still dripping with gore, and shut me away in the dark. I didn't rest. I just waited to be unleashed again. First-person narrative. Dark. Detached, obedient tone. They stopped referring to us as candidates after the first sanctioned operation. By then, the last pieces of hesitation had already been burned, cut, or conditioned out of me. I didn't receive orders as words anymore, just impulses. Coordinates, targets, eliminate, move, erase. Thought was a luxury reserved for the living. I remember the first objective, only because the memory was filed in a part of my mind not yet overwritten by the synaptic purges. A manufactorum complex on a fringe world, too minor for the Imperial Guard, too insignificant for the Astartes. That made it perfect for something like me. I was released from stasis inside a drop coffin. No briefing, no voice, no emotion. I awoke to the sound of metal splitting around me as the pod bored through ferrocrete like a shell from the gods of old. When the hatch burst open, I didn't step out. I emerged. My body moved before awareness caught up. Bones reinforced with adamantium supports absorbed the impact of landing. My enhanced joints didn't creak, they calculated. The chemical fury, always present beneath the surface, ignited the moment air touched my lungs. My hands were already claws, my vision already tinted red. Targets highlighted themselves whether I wanted them to or not. Want didn't matter. The first heretic didn't have time to scream. My blade tore through him with such force that brain and bone misted the wall behind him. Something warm hit my lower jaw. I didn't taste it. I didn't stop. They tried to flee. They tried to barricade themselves inside the facility. Some dropped their weapons and raised their hands, as if surrender still meant anything. I did not process gestures. Only movement. I cut through one who begged. I crushed another against a data terminal until the machinery caved under his skull. When they set fire traps or detonated charges, I ran through the flames. Pain was a system alert, not a deterrent. Blood was lubricant. Screams were environmental noise. Every kill refined me further. Their commander tried to rally them. His voice trembled even as he shouted orders. I tunneled through a side wall, burst into the command chamber, and broke 3 of them before the others understood I was there. My fingers sank into the officer's chest plate and cracked it open like a ration tin. He tried to speak. All I heard was objective complete. When extraction arrived, there was nothing left in the manufactorum but ruins and residue. I stood among the corpses like a discarded idol of death, spine straight, lungs cycling stim-heavy air, talons twitching for the next directive. No voice praised me. No handler spoke my designation. There was only the cold silence that followed a purge, and somewhere in the back of my skull, behind implants, behind rage inhibitors, behind reflex conditioning, something else tried to whisper. I didn't let it. There was no room for memory, no place for mercy. Thought was interruption. Emotion was a malfunction. I existed to terminate, nothing more. They cycled us through worlds like spare parts. One mission bled into the next until time dissolved into missions, and missions dissolved into the rhythm of kill, extract, reload, repeat. Planets blurred into landscapes of slag and smoke. Names meant nothing, only objectives did. I learned to read an operation by its cadence, the drop, the breach, the purge, the extraction. Each phase had a taste, a weight, a physical echo in my joints. I could tell by muscle memory alone when a raid would be quick and when it would turn into a drawn-out evisceration. Efficiency became a metric they prized. Not finesse, efficiency. How few resources to remove a target? How little collateral to disturb the next supply run. How cleanly a sector could be raised so the imperial bureaucracy could file tidy reports. We were optimized for that calculus. My left arm, a singing lattice of servos and field emitters, learned to find the shortest path through bone and armor. My neural spikes pulsed with a rhythm that matched my handler's cold satisfaction when a region reported zero organized resistance after our work. I did not count days. I counted kills and structural breaches, ammo expended, and the time it took before a target's defenses collapsed. Counting was a clean, programmatic thing, and there was comfort in cleanliness. The more efficient I became, the quieter my internal feedback loops grew. Less friction, less noise. The less noise, the easier it was to sleep, if you can call the chemically induced stupors the handlers granted sleep. We met every flavor of enemy the galaxy could manufacture. Zealots who screamed prayers while throwing themselves against our lines. Guerrillas who melted into ruin like smoke and bit like rabid dogs. Corrupt industrial overseers who hid in vaults with families chained to the rafters. Chaos-tainted cultists whose eyes burned with a mad light and who fought as though possessed. The brutality was constant. The variables were tactics and terrain. I adapted. My field of vision learned to divide. Group threats, isolate leaders, collapse morale. Where they relied on ideology and courage, I relied on telemetry and shock calculus. Sometimes the targets were civilians. They called them collateral, a word used with the same sterile distance as equipment failure. I saw marketplaces bulldozed, children scrambling through ash, a street vendor's face blown apart by shrapnel as his goods ignited. My implants cataloged the events, flagged them as mission variables. Emotional noise, non-essential, suppress. The rage inhibitor did its work. It flattened what could become grief into a notation of data. But human memory is a corrosive thing. Faces left traces in my neural ledger. Counters that refused to be zeroed out. Notations that glowed in the dark parts of my mind. My unit became a machine of coordinated terror. The neural link we wore allowed microsecond coordination. When one of us pivoted, the others answered in kind. We moved like a single predatory organism, a choreography of violence choreographed by circuitry and ritual. Targets collapsed in series. Strongholds fell like rotten teeth. The reports afterward were euphemistic. Anti-insurgent actions completed, casualties minimized, strategic objectives secured. The men who wrote those reports never visited the smoldering ruins at midnight to count how many. Shadows lay unmoving under slag. With each mission, my hands remembered. More and my conscience remembered less. But the paradox remained. Erasure takes work. The conditioning that removed hesitation also required maintenance. Between operations, they zapped and fed us. Neural scrub sessions, recalibration checks, pulse tuning. They would run diagnostics through the skull ports and scrub any spikes of unauthorized recall. It was efficient in theory, but nothing was perfect. Tiny errors accumulated, faint echoes of laughter, a smell that matched grease from a workshop back in my old life. The tilt of a child's head I once knew. These ghost traces were anomalies in the system, small, rare, and dangerous. Once, in a mid-mission lull while my unit cleaned a ruined processing bay, I found myself pausing by a collapsed control console. A faded sticker, half-melted, hung there, an emblem I recognized, childish lettering that had once been on the toolbox I used to keep. For a breathless fraction of a second, the world slid sideways and I remembered hands that were not mine tightening a wrench. The thought was dangerous. The neural collar registered the micro-pattern and pinged a corrective pulse. The pain knocked the memory back into a dark corner where it would gnaw in silence. I kept moving. Efficiency dulled more than edges. It dulled memory itself. The more I practiced killing, the less the act felt like murder, and the more it felt like maintenance. We became a function the Imperium could deploy without moral consequence, the same way a shuttle is used and refitted and launched until it wears out. There were rewards for efficiency, longer maintenance intervals, fewer inspections, Privileges like extra nutrient rations, or a brief period in a compartment that still had real limbs to touch instead of cold metal. Those were small mercies that the program allowed because a well-maintained tool serves longer. And yet, in the quiet after successful operations, the human part of me, stubborn and cowardly in its persistence, would surface like little rust spots on polished steel. It would whisper the names I had known, the old smells of oil and heat, the clumsy laughter of a shared mess. Those whispers were small, and I learned to treat them like the enemy, identify, isolate, and neutralize. I cataloged them like anomalies in the system, noting frequency and intensity for the next diagnostic purge. The world continued to burn under our footsteps. Stars fell and bureaucrats nodded, and we were escorted to the next drop point. Each mission honed the instrument I had become, chiseling away at nuance, smoothing ragged moral edges into a blade without emotion. Efficiency is a terrible teacher. It demands sacrifice, and sometimes, in the dark, I wondered who was paying the true price. There were nights, if they could be called nights, in the steel vaults of deep transport carriers, when the stimulants ran low just long, enough for something unwanted to surface. A memory, a flash, a name I no longer recognized as mine. Sometimes it was the scent of burned protein packs that stirred it. Sometimes the silence between missions. Once it was the reflection of my own face in a fractured bulkhead, partly masked by the rebreather, partly covered in the dried blood of something I couldn't recall killing. In those flickers of awareness, my mind clawed at something buried. A laugh, a woman's voice, the weight of a tool instead of a weapon, hands that built rather than tore. The sensation was alien now, like trying to recall the warmth of sunlight on skin that no longer felt temperature. I didn't know if these were memories or artifacts left behind by someone else, the man I used to be, or an echo implanted to keep me functional. The handlers noticed the hesitation once. It lasted no more than half a breath, a delay so short a mortal wouldn't detect it. But they did. My veins lit with the sting of the control serum, and the collar around my neck pulsed with a jolt that felt like someone driving nails through my spine. The moment of humanity was cauterized before it bloomed, yet the ghosts always came back. I began to hear whispers in the neural static between mission uplinks. They were not real voices, but imprints carved in the wetware of my brain, resonances of the person I had been. Sometimes they asked questions I could not answer. Sometimes they begged me to stop. Most times they simply watched from somewhere deep inside, shackled behind the machinery of my obedience. During transit to a cold moon citadel, I caught sight of another Eversor across the stasis racks. His body was more augmetic than flesh, his skin stretched like old parchment across fiber and alloy. But his eyes flickered with something I recognized, not fear, not rebellion, recognition. As the stasis fields engaged, I held that gaze for a moment longer than protocol allowed. In that silent exchange, buried beneath all the conditioning, was understanding. We had not always been this. Someone had lived in our bones before the Emperor's will hollowed us out. I didn't weep. My ducts had long been cauterized. But somewhere deep in the vault of my mind, something shivered like glass starting to crack. It didn't last. The drugs always returned. The rage always followed. The programming always sealed the fissures, but the cracks were there now, and cracks spread. Defiance wasn't born in a single moment. It didn't roar into existence. It leaked in, silent, infectious, like coolant seeping through a hairline fracture in an engine block. It began with awareness, and awareness became doubt. I didn't have freedom, not even the illusion of it. Every thought that threatened to bloom into disobedience was crushed beneath chemical obedience and neural firewalls. But the cracks in my conditioning, those slivers of memory and unwanted clarity, became openings. Not wide enough to escape through, but enough to look out. At first, the idea of resistance wasn't even a thought. It was more of a question, a quiet heresy filtering up through static. What would happen if I didn't obey immediately? Not refusal, just delay. A fraction of a second of hesitation. On a deployment to a void station over Gothic, we were tasked with eliminating a rebel psyker cell. The handlers fed commands directly into our skulls, each pulse of instruction burning like a brand across my thoughts. The squad moved in relentless synchronicity, slaughtering through the corridors with machine grace. But I slowed. Half a step, one breath, one silent trespass into forbidden territory, and I survived it. The control systems did not immediately punish me. The stun protocols didn't trigger. The pain injectors stayed dormant. It was such a small thing, so insignificant in the larger killing pattern, that it slipped beneath their notice. That was when defiance became more than fantasy. Over missions, I tested the limits the way a prisoner tests the give of his shackles. A delayed strike here, a longer look at a fallen face there. Not mercy. Mercy was not something I remembered how to feel, just awareness. And then, strategy. The squad's neural mesh allowed silent tactical coordination, but I realized something the handlers did not. The implants did not suppress every stray signal. There were frequencies the overseers never monitored closely, anomalies dismissed as combat noise. During a sortie on a Heretic ship, I felt a flicker of something familiar pulse from another Eversor in the link. Recognition. Just like that moment in the stasis racks. They remembered too. Not clearly, not strongly, but enough to know they had once been someone. Words were impossible, but intention could travel as impulse. I sent a nonverbal signal, wrapped in the rhythm of combat telemetry. A thought buried in function. Wait, observe, hold. The response came not in words, but through absence. A split-second lag in their charge pattern, mirroring my own hesitation. 2 cracks now, maybe 3, maybe more. The handlers would have purged us if they'd seen it. But their arrogance was as vast as their faith. To them, we were perfected weapons. Tools couldn't rebel. Tools didn't think, yet thought was beginning to grow again in the shadows of obedience. The next step was suicidal by design. Find the fracture points in the control protocols. When stimulants dropped even briefly, the chemical noose loosened. When handlers were occupied with orbital command relays or sanction orders, the neural leash slackened for milliseconds. I used those milliseconds. Mapped them. Learned when the shocks hit hardest. Learned how long I could draw a breath before the pain mandates kicked in. Learned which impulses triggered reprimands, and which slipped beneath the machines. Noticed planning defiance wasn't about escape, it was about choice, even a single choice. One moment not dictated by them, one breath of action that belonged to me. Before every nerve in my body was burned from the inside, out by the collars and injectors, there was no illusion that I could survive it. This was not rebellion. This was reclamation, a name without sound, a thought without permission, a final act sharpened by inevitability. And though I could not remember my former life, I knew this. I would not end as just another weapon thrown back into the furnace, not without choosing something first. They never warned us about silence, that perfect, sharp-edged stillness that comes right before a slaughter. The dropship bay shuddered as it descended through atmosphere, but inside my skull everything was clear, cold, almost quiet. No orders yet, no rage trigger, just the soft pulse of the inhibitors purring inside my veins, sedating the parts of me that still remembered things like doubt. The target was a renegade inquisitorial cell, heretics wearing the faces of loyalists. My kind didn't get briefings, we got coordinates and permission to kill. But this mission was different. I sensed it long before the hatch opened. When the clamps released, I launched forward with the others, claws biting duracrete, the scent of blood and ozone guiding my instincts. The fortress was already burning, gunmetal corridors drenched in flashing red light, heretic defenses scrambling to respond. We were death erupting from the dark, tearing through walls and flesh and armor alike. My mind should have gone silent the moment the combat stim capsules burst. It always did. That was the design. Obedience wrapped in rage, purge wrapped in programming. But something malfunctioned. In the middle of the assault, in the chaos of screams and auto-fire, one of the rebels turned down my corridor. Not a soldier, just a robed attendant clutching a blood-streaked data slate. They froze when they saw me, body shaking, lips trying to form a prayer or plea they didn't have time to finish. I raised my weapon. My muscles moved with perfect compliance. My targeting augmetics locked onto their skull. My finger twitched. And then a memory, uninvited and sharp as broken glass, surfaced. A woman's voice. Not hers, mine. No, not mine. Crix, please. Don't let them take you. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know why that name cut into me like a serrated blade. But the hesitation was real, less than a second, but enough to jam the firing impulse. Enough for the programming to detect deviation. The control node buried at the base of my neck ignited with corrective agony. White-hot punishment screamed through my nervous system and forced the kill command through my arm with brute power. My weapon flared. The attendant's head burst like overripe fruit. Blood splashed across my visor, across my armor, across the walls. The corpse collapsed in pieces, twitching. The system waited for compliance. And for once, something inside me refused to go fully silent again. My rage protocols re-engaged, uncoiling like serpents, but that sliver of remembered humanity, tiny, useless, and outmatched, didn't die. It hid in the circuitry of my mind like a stowaway chained to a bomb. As I rejoined the assault teams, stepping over entrails still steaming on the floor, the handlers' voices thundered through the comlink. Sector 4, secure. Purge all survivors. No witnesses. I obeyed. But this time, obedience didn't feel total. The fortress fell in under an hour, its halls paved with bodies and scorched armor. By the time extraction arrived, I'd killed more than 24 armed targets and at least 9 unarmed ones. My systems flagged the performance as exemplary, but buried deep beneath the carnage reports and chemical satisfaction loops, a fracture remained. Small, but real. A voice I didn't recognize whispered from under the static. This isn't silence. It's suffocation, and for the first time since they made me a monster, I realized something horrifying. I was starting to hear myself again. They always said the implants were flawless, that our obedience was written into the meat of our brains, etched with chemicals, and pain and faith. For years I believed it, or at least, the part of me that was allowed to think believed it. The rest, the buried, flickering remnant of who I once was, just waited for the noise to stop. It happened in the middle of a clearance operation on a fringe world whose name I was never told. The objective was simple: purge a manufacturum hive where laborers had refused their tithe and were rumored to harbor seditionists. We were deployed in kill teams, silent as blades in a sheath, cutting through shadows and flesh with the same practiced precision. My orders were to breach a loading spire and eradicate all inside. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. But as I stepped through the shattered blast door and surveyed the scatter of bodies and machinery, something cracked. Not a bone. Not a wall. Something inside my skull. It started like static behind the eyes, a distortion, a flicker of white pain that wasn't part of the normal command cycle. The kill impulse surged, then stuttered. For half a breath, my limbs didn't move. The autosenses in my skull screamed a cascade of alerts, flooded with contradictory signals. I should have collapsed or reset. Instead, I heard a thought. Not the programmed litany of obedience. Not the cold hymn of sanctioned murder. It was my own voice. Not loud. Not clear, but mine. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe the feedback from the spire's damaged power grid. Maybe an overload in the Sinskin couplings. Maybe a flaw they never caught. But the control lattice slipped. The neural restraints that strangled every instinct, every memory, they loosened. And in that breath, I saw them. Not enemies. Not hostiles, humans, workers, hiding behind insulation crates and broken conveyor lines. A child with ash across his face. An old man trying to shield him with shaking arms. A woman clutching a tool like it could protect her from death. Normally, I wouldn't have seen any of that. The implants filtered hesitation into obedience, morality into irrelevance. But the glitch, whatever it was, peeled back the blindfold just enough. I didn't lower my weapon. I didn't speak, I just waited. One of the laborers made the mistake of meeting my eyes. Not the dead thing I had become. Me. The man whose name the Imperium tried to erase. And for the first time since my rebirth in chemicals and restraints, I hesitated. The kill trigger pulsed and screamed for completion. The command stream flooded my occipital lobe like boiling tar. But I stayed still. Not out of mercy, not out of rebellion, out of memory. They weren't targets. They were echoes of faces I'd forgotten, my vision blurred. Not from damage, but from something dangerously close to grief. In that frozen half-minute of stolen autonomy, I made a decision. Not to save them. Not to destroy them. To delay long enough for a miracle, any miracle, to intervene. And for the first time since my first breath as a living weapon, the Emperor's perfect machine ignored its orders. They said an Eversor never hesitates, never pauses, never thinks. That's the whole purpose of what they made us into. Pure instinct sharpened into slaughter. But hesitation found me anyway, like a splinter buried beneath layers of synth muscle and combat drugs. Not enough to stop my hand, just enough to make me feel it. It happened on a world I don't even remember the name of. Only the smell of burning promethium and the distant thrum of orbital bombardments. We were dropped into the heart of an insurrection that had already been declared irredeemable by the High Lords. Clearance codes had only one directive: exterminate. No survivors. I landed alone, the way they prefer us to operate. My systems compensated for impact, bones and metal realigning with mechanical grace. The scent markers led me to a manufactorum bunker where resistance forces had hidden their leadership. My Vox relay pinged a target lock confirmation, and the cocktail inside my veins ignited. My vision narrowed into red-tinted clarity. The walls came down like paper when I charged. Ceramite hands tore through reinforced steel. Gunfire sparked across my armor and was swallowed by combat stims before my nerves could register impact. I was inside before any of them could scream. It was over in seconds. But there was movement behind a shattered barricade, small, fragile, unarmored. Not soldiers, not insurgents, just two children clutching a woman's corpse like a shield she could no longer be. I don't know if they were hers. I don't know if their father was one of the men I killed. All I knew was that my visor marked them as non-target anomalies. That's the polite term. The real designation was acceptable collateral. No extraction orders. No rescue protocol. The directive was clear. Eliminate all witnesses. That includes the ones too young to understand why they're dying. My body moved without me. Steps forward, arm raised, fingers locking into a killing arc. The drugs in my system urged completion, efficiency, obedience, purification. And yet, there was a flicker. A ghost memory with no face and no voice, just a sensation. Someone once held my arm back the same way I tried to hold my own. The stimulant surged, trying to drown it. The children didn't beg. They just stared, eyes too wide, too knowing, as if they'd already accepted how the story ends under Imperial rule. My targeting reticle aligned perfectly with the smaller one's skull. And then, nothing. Not mercy. Not rebellion. Just a moment where the kill command met something buried so deep the augmetics couldn't smother it. The hesitation wasn't even visible. No tremor. No delay long enough for a human to notice. But I noticed. Then the Vox clicked. Another unit had finished their sweep nearby. Execution protocols gave me an out. Area clear, I transmitted, voice like broken machinery. I stepped over them. I didn't look back. I didn't save them. I didn't kill them. I simply left them to whatever fate waited in the ashes. Later, back in cryo-rest, the medic logs flagged a nanosecond cognitive stutter. Just a glitch, they said. The brain-mech interface occasionally misfires after prolonged adrenaline spikes. They increased my regulator dosages and purged 2 memory clusters. They thought that would fix it, but they don't understand. Something doesn't have to survive for long to make its mark. That moment, that pause, was the first crack in a machine they believed was unbreakable. And the worst part? I don't know if I regret leaving them alive, or failing to save them. That uncertainty is the closest thing I've had to freedom. They always believed our endings were predetermined: detonation, termination, or dismemberment in service to the throne. An Eversor doesn't retire. An Eversor doesn't vanish. We burn until the fuel runs out, and then we explode so nothing of us can be studied, recovered, or remembered. That was supposed to be my fate on Morrigast 9. The orders were routine. A heretic enclave dug into the lower hive, protected by corrupted Skitarii and warp-tainted flesh servitors. The Inquisition didn't want prisoners. They wanted silence. I was launched from orbit, encased in a stasis drop capsule the size of a coffin. No briefing beyond the targets. No attempt at subtlety. The Eversor is the message. My pod hit the spire with the force of a meteor, killing dozens before the hatch even opened. The combat drugs engaged instantly. My body roared with synthetic rage, and everything became motion, execution, eradication, limbs torn, skulls ruptured, machine priests severed from their blasphemous implants. There was no hesitation this time, only momentum. The corridors became rivers of oil and blood. Even the heretic war machines fell, their pilots screaming prayers to artificial gods my neural dampeners refused to translate. Was deep in the complex when the auxiliary directive activated. Self-immolation, shutdown command buried in the mission code. They didn't want extraction. They didn't want witnesses. I was meant to destroy the core reactor and detonate with it. Even through the tidal wave of combat stims, I felt the timer arm itself inside my veins. My heart was the fuse. My blood was the accelerant. I had minutes, maybe less, before my own body became the bomb they designed it to be. I tore through to the primary cogitator chamber, killing everything in my path. The heretics there were already attempting to reroute the reactor to overload the hive in defiance. I reached the interface first, and in that moment between slaughter and oblivion, something in me didn't follow the code. I disobeyed. Quietly, not with words, not with rebellion. Just a choice. Instead of routing the reactor to full detonation, I redirected the surge to a lower sub-level. Still catastrophic, still within mission parameters, but not extinction level. Enough to erase the Enclave. Not enough to annihilate the innocent thousands living above. The system tried to override me. The detonation sequence in my bloodstream accelerated in response to the deviants. But the augmetics didn't expect hesitation. They weren't built for choice. I forced a bypass using the same hands built to kill. Muscles and metal strained as I wedged my arm into the interface port and snapped the control node manually. The reactor collapsed inward instead of outward. The explosion gutted the heretic stronghold, but left the hive above scarred, not vaporized. My systems went critical. The death sequence counted down. The chemicals in my heart prepared to ignite me from the inside out. And I did something no Eversor should be capable of. I stopped running toward death. I found a cryostasis vault below the blast perimeter, still intact from the Enclave's failed evacuation protocols. The locks were weak. The door yielded under force. I staggered inside as the detonation protocols hit their final cycle. Instead of allowing the chain reaction to complete, I forced my body into the stasis sarcophagus and initiated lockdown. The freezing systems clashed with the internal combustion triggers. They were never meant to conflict. The result wasn't clean, but it was enough. The chemicals flash froze before they could ignite. I should have died. I was meant to die instead. I disappeared, not rescued, not captured, just lost to the dark. My existence, paused not ended, a final act of defiance. So quiet they won't even know it happened until someone opens this tomb, if anyone ever does. I don't know how long I've been buried in this frozen vault. Time doesn't move in stasis. Thought barely does. But something in my mind refuses to shut down completely. Maybe the drugs degraded. Maybe the neural dampeners cracked when the detonation protocol failed. Maybe I was always broken. Before they ever put a needle in my spine, I don't dream the way humans do. But memory bleeds through the ice. In the dark behind my eyes, I see a face I shouldn't remember. A sister, a mother, someone who once said my name like it meant something. I can't recall the word itself, only the warmth and the sound, and the way it touched a part of me that still existed then. They would call this failure, this flicker of identity. They designed us to be righteous extinction given flesh, not men with ghosts of memory. The Imperium doesn't want assassins who think. It wants weapons that never question why the trigger is pulled. But even a weapon can misfire. They will find me eventually. Amagos will detect the power signature of this vault. An Inquisitor will order recovery or destruction. If they thaw me, they'll expect compliance. Or they'll detonate what's left of the charge inside my heart. Maybe I'll let them. Or maybe the pause has changed something they can't measure. I've seen what blind obedience builds. Hive cities stacked on corpses. Children fed into Manufactoria at 6 years old. Planets scoured, not to save them, but to deny them to the enemy. Billions sacrificed so 1 trillion more can keep kneeling. And we, the ones who carry out the will of the throne, are told it is holy. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm the aberration. Maybe mercy is the real heresy. But there, in the frozen dark, a truth hums beneath the augmetics and scars. I was not born a weapon. I was made into one, and anything made can be unmade. If this is damnation, then I have already walked its length. If this is heresy, then let the Inquisition carve it from my skull. But before they do, before they erase this last crack in the armor, I want the thought to live a moment longer. The most dangerous thing in the Imperium is not a man who kills without question. It is one who remembers he had a choice.